Welcome to The Cusp, a podcast that tries to give you the straight dope on what's actually happening with artificial intelligence, how jobs are changing, and what that means for education and workforce development. I'm Paul Fain, editor of the Job Newsletter and co-founder of WorkShift. Thanks for listening. I've got another episode for you that features two guest experts. Alex Kotran starts things off. Kotran is co-founder and CEO of the AI Education Project, a nonprofit that seeks to bring equitable AI literacy and workforce readiness to untapped communities across America. He's followed by Leigh DeLyser, co-founder and executive director of Computer Science for All, a nonprofit group that's working to make high-quality computer science an integral part of K-12 education in the U.S. While both of my guests focus mostly on K-12 schools, they tackle a broad range of questions here, with plenty of implications for higher education, the workforce, and society at large. My interviews with Alex and Leigh were recorded in early April, which is a long time ago in the dog years of artificial intelligence. But despite all the recent news around AI, their thoughts hold up here in June. How was it June, by the way? For example, my bet is Alex hasn't changed what about AI's impacts most keeps him up at night. Spoiler alert. It's what we don't know about how jobs will change and what that means for young people who'll be entering the labor market a few years down the road. All right, we've got a lot to cover, so let's fire it up. So we're live with Alex Kotran. How you doing, Alex?
I'm well. It's weird. It's rainy and sunny in San Francisco. Kind of a combination of like ethereal atmospherics and California sunshine.
Alex, with your work at the AI Education Project, you're talking to a lot of people who know a lot about what's actually happening with AI in education. But I wanted to start with really, how bullish are you on the big change that we're on the cusp of?
It depends on like what I'm bullish on. So basically, whoever you are, wherever you sit, the question you need to answer for yourself is this another hype cycle? And I think it's actually very reasonable for people to be cynical. We heard all about the metaverse and the crypto and NFTs, and, AI is certainly the latest flavor to come out of Silicon Valley. And yet Silicon Valley has not always been wrong. The computing age, the internet, the mobile revolution, those were not hype cycles. Those were transformational technologies. And so you kind of have to decide for yourself. Maybe one way to think about this is in 2 years, will there still be AI conferences, or will we be on to the next thing? And I would posit that we will definitely still be talking about artificial intelligence. The things we talk about might shift a little bit. I suspect it'll be a little bit more focused on workforce and less focused on the tools. So in terms of the trajectory of the technology, I'm not bullish about specific companies. So like if you're an investor, is now the right time to dump money into any one of the thousands of startups that are trying to use AI to do X, Y, Z? That's for you to decide. I personally wouldn't be putting my money into any specific tools. But if you're betting on the 5-year arc, in 5 years, are we still going to be talking about AI? I think the answer is definitively yes. And that's because if you're making the case for this is just a hype cycle, the cynical case would go something like this. Large language models, the transformer architecture, certainly groundbreaking, but, we're basically already seeing the limits of what it's capable of. And, no matter how much compute or data we throw at language models, we're only going to get incremental improvements. And you'd also have to say something like, and GPT-4, Claude, Opus, while these language models are quite cool and they certainly catch people's attention, they're really not sophisticated enough to replace meaningful baskets of tasks that workers do. You might also say something like, we're going to run out of data, or, we're going to run into sort of literal physical limitations to how we manufacture, the semiconductors that power these models. But in the last couple of weeks, we saw NVIDIA release Blackwell, or unveil Blackwell, which is the latest sort of iteration of their GPUs. These are like the $40,000 GPUs that Meta and OpenAI have been buying up as fast as possible. And Blackwell, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's something like an order of magnitude, not just more powerful, but also more efficient. And one of the other cynical cases is that we're actually going to run out of electricity. Like literally, like the power consumption required to power these models is so significant that it's never going to be cost effective.
Well, we have to, crack the fusion nut to do that, according to Sam Altman, but that's a different podcast.
Perhaps, yeah. But so, you have Blackwell, and then you have, a lot of research coming out that shows just GPT-4 is sufficiently powerful enough to reach nearly 90% accuracy in medical diagnostics. And when
Right.
I talk to folks in, like, for example, in the medical space, what they will say, what they have said is, even if the technology froze today, it is powerful enough to significantly impact a very meaningful array of applications in healthcare. And so the bullish case or the non-cynical case is, these models, even today, these models are powerful enough that, once we figure out how to implement them really effectively and how to integrate them into workflows, they actually are going to start to displace a lot of tasks. And the paradigm is not, oh, can AI replace me and all the stuff that I do? The paradigm is rather, can AI make me 10% more efficient or more productive? And that might not be enough to replace you, but if you're a company that employs 100,000 people and suddenly you achieve a 10% increase in productivity or efficiency, either you're going to invest in and grow, or you might use that as an opportunity to cut costs. And that's why, I'm bullish on the technology continuing to improve and continuing to be very impactful, but I'm quite bearish on society's ability to adapt at the pace that the technology is going to improve. I think that we are so enamored by the shiny objects and the widgets that we're missing the much more important conversation, especially in education. All the education conferences right now it's all about, like, oh, like, how can AI transform teaching and learning? How can teachers use these tools? How can students use these tools? Very important discussions to have. But to me, the much more important conversation is, if you're a sophomore or a freshman in high school today, you're, 3 to 7, 8 years away from your first job.
Yeah.
And what is the impact going to be on your career trajectories? And that the answer is probably pretty significant.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we're preparing students for this world where the pathways that we've talked about, like business and engineering and mathematics and STEM, like, those pathways might actually end up narrowing a bit.
So, Alex, I used to cover higher ed exclusively, and I haven't heard too much of this, but I know it's out there. I think there are some folks that are like, look, this is going to blow over. Like, let's just hunker down and wait for this to blow over. In K-12, I've heard more of the, everybody told us that the iPad was going to change everything. And now I have to kind of yank screens out of my students' hands. And I think more of the actual lived experience of things not living up to the hype. I mean, are you getting a sense that there's resistance from folks based on that sort of experience?
Yeah, I mean, ed tech more broadly, right, has largely failed to live up to the promises to totally transform education. It's certainly impacted education,
Right.
but we haven't actually seen really meaningful improvements in student outcomes as a result of all these tools. So again, very reasonable for educators to be cynical. I think we're on a 10 to 15 year time frame for AI truly transforming education. And I guess, like, where I'm coming from is, schools are still figuring out the should we use AI, how might we use AI, or what are the best use cases for AI. Companies are totally focused on, implementation.
Right.
They've already decided that we want this. There's definitely value to be had, and there's more money now flowing into AI than any other technology, probably all technology and R&D combined. Google, by way of example, has 190,000 employees. They spend more on GPUs today than people. And
I
so
didn't
that
know
is
that.
the world we live in, where, like, the biggest companies in the world have decided that this is the future. That is really meaningfully different than crypto and the metaverse.
Right.
Sure, Meta changed their name, but the metaverse unit within Meta has gotten smaller, not bigger. So I think if you sort of zoom out and take a look at just some of the data and the executive order that came out from the White House, there was not an executive order around the metaverse. So there's, like, some pretty meaningful differences between sort of like past hype cycles and this one. And even if it takes longer than planned, like 8 years versus 5 years, like, these are still very short timeframes to adapt to what is, a actual transformation and not just iteration. And ed tech, I would argue, is an iteration, not transformation.
So once K-12 educators move past the should I, to the how and the what do you see as kind of first order needs, to really make sure that students are getting prepared? What are the needs that you're hearing from folks, and what's actually being done?
Well, I don't know that schools have totally figured out the needs. I think that they are still trying to wrap their heads around the first question you asked. And the challenge is that, administrators are being inundated with companies trying to peddle AI tools. And so there's a lot of talk about, like, policies and guidelines and what tools do we buy and what are the procurement standards. What are standards of efficacy? What are the use cases? So that's where a lot of schools' heads are at. I think the bigger question is, what does it look like to prepare every single student with AI literacy, where this is no longer something that's siloed into a STEM track? 6% of kids in the US are enrolled in an introductory computer science class. If 6% of kids graduate with AI literacy, that is a very, very bad outcome. So schools, I think, the schools that we talk to that are working with AI EDU, they're starting to hone in on like, what would it look like for us to make AI education something that looks more like the way we talk about the internet? And, you don't have a track for the internet. Every student is using the internet, in many cases in most of their classes. And I think AI is going to look more like that, where it's something that's integrated across the learning experience. What we do with schools is we really focus on teacher professional development and professional learning, because like, irrespective of whatever strategy you're pursuing, whether that's, using tools, whether that's giving students access to tools, whether that's workforce preparedness, teachers need to be on the front lines, and they need to have all the context. They need to understand the why. Why is this important? They need to understand, how does AI intersect with what I teach? And that applies to humanities teachers in addition to STEM teachers. And so our work with districts is very much, okay, how do you build, cross staff AI literacy as kind of a necessary first step? And whatever the next step is, if that's implementing tools, you're going to be better off implementing tools and doing the change management if your staff understands how to use those tools safely and responsibly and effectively, and how not to use them. And the same goes for dealing with academic integrity and cheating. Like, it's folly to try to use tools to block and catch students using ChatGPT. The real solution is we have to, redefine the way we do assessments and the way we assign homework and the type of work products that students are creating. And also, it's going to be less about the work product and more about the process to getting there. Kind of like with calculators, like we figured out, oh, you need to actually show your work, and students are graded, are getting more points in many cases based on the work that they show, not necessarily just getting the right answer. But to figure that stuff out, it's not just like a cheat sheet that you hand out to teachers. It really is sort of like holistic knowledge and sort of an intuitive understanding of what the tools are capable of, so that teachers can design around it. And I just, my parents are both educators. My mom has taught math and Akron public schools her whole career. So I really believe in this sort of teacher-centric approach. And my concern is that we aren't equipping teachers to be at the table and co-designing these systems. And that's, I think, really critical if we want to have positive outcomes in the education system.
Absolutely. That totally makes sense. I wonder, just to give folks a sense of what's possible, I mean, are you seeing school districts that are really doing a great job of this? I mean, I'm guessing they're not the norm. Can you give me a sense of what success looks like right now for a school district?
Yes. I mean, like, we're working with, by way of example, like Prince George's County Public Schools in right outside of DC in Maryland, New York City Public Schools, Anaheim Union School District outside of LA. We're working statewide in Ohio. And in those places, what those districts have honed in on is, we want every teacher to have access to professional learning about AI. You start by building AI literacy. And what that enables is, New York City, LAUSD, by way of example, they're releasing student-facing LLMs, but they realize that before they roll those out district-wide, they need teachers to be trained and prepped. And so that sort of foundational AI literacy is kind of like that necessary condition for whatever comes next. Gwinnett County really comes to mind. I mean, they were very early to this. I mean, even when AI EDU was founded, back in 2019, 2020, Gwinnett County was like, they had decided, we want to have AI literacy that is deployed across the district. It's not just a track. They built a lot of their own sort of frameworks to doing that and
Let
focus
me
on.
ask you just quickly there, because that's pre-GPT, right? Like, that's before everything, the world blew up here. Like, what was the mechanism for that? Who led that? Was that a superintendent? Did it bubble up? Like, do you have an idea of how that, because that's really being ahead of the curve. And I'm just wondering, like, what sort of leadership needs to be there for that to happen?
So in almost every case, the user journey looks something like a senior administrator, whether it's a soup or an assistant soup, who sees AI as an opportunity to establish a legacy and takes it upon themselves to be that sort of like first mover pioneer and takes ownership and champions it. But to really be successful, you have to get buy-in from teachers, which is hard because right now in districts, teachers are being hit with a lot of stuff from their administrators. And so the districts that I think have done this well have been very savvy about not making AI like one more thing, but rather connecting it to some of these threads that have been around for a while. Like ultimately, I would argue that AI literacy is not a new thing, but rather the natural evolution of 21st century skills or digital literacy. We talk about like, ultimately, how do you know if students are ready for the age of AI? Are their classrooms implementing project-based learning, critical thinking, problem solving, communication skills, the four C's? Schools that have done this effectively have been able to make that case that this is actually not totally new, but rather just a different way of packaging a set of priorities that have been on educators' minds, not necessarily successfully implemented. Like we work in the state of Hawaii, and we did a big statewide training at the Schools of the Future Summit. And, they were talking to us about a big initiative they had for project-based learning. So they raised a bunch of money and they were doing teacher fellowships and professional development around PBL. And once that funding ran out, it kind of just lost steam. And I think, less than 2% of the classrooms in Hawaii are consistently using project-based learning. So, for Hawaii, it probably looks something like, how do we figure that out first? Because, project-based learning is really sort of, I think, a core to preparing students for this future where they're just going to, it's not going to be about the content that they memorize or the knowledge in specific domains that they have, but rather, are they able to, the adaptability quotient is something that I've heard recently, and I really like it, the AQ. What are the teaching techniques that build AQ, that adaptability quotient? And what are the easiest pathways or the pathways of least resistance to getting there?
Really helpful. I think I can see a world where you're able to at least chip away at AI literacy for teachers in K-12 school. I feel like it would be harder to envision a world where you can see helping them understand how jobs are going to change. This is the kind of like the bane of my reporting existence of trying to figure out like specifics on how, coding being the best example, right? Like you don't really have to learn how to code now. Maybe you can use tools to code. You just have to know when and how and why. How are you seeing schools wrestle with that piece? Do they need to at this point? Is it too early?
Yeah, this is what keeps me up at night. I don't want to shortchange that there probably are schools that are thinking about this. But the reality is, if someone comes to you and says, oh, yeah, I'll tell you what the jobs of the future are, they're full of it. Nobody knows what the jobs of the future are. 6-12 months ago, there were a lot of folks, and there's still some folks that are saying, oh, prompt engineer, that's going to be the job of the future. I think it's pretty clear now that that's like saying, oh, internet users are the job. It's like,
Right.
You're going to use prompt engineering is going to be a skill, but it's not going to be like a vocation. So I think, the challenge for schools is we're going to have to adapt to an environment where we don't know what the jobs of the future are. But I think what we can say with a bit more certainty is, what are the skills of the future?
Right.
And to me, it's like, okay, if you want to figure out, is my job at risk of being replaced by AI? Open up your calendar. How many meetings do you have on your calendar? Are you spending most of your day interacting with people or with customers or with clients? Or are you an individual contributor where you're doing a lot of writing, a lot of coding, a lot of analysis? And if it's the latter, those are the type of jobs that are probably going to be, the lower hanging fruit. And again, it's not that the whole job gets replaced. It's just, can we extract some efficiency with some of these productivity tools? Because the difference between the iPad and large language models is, I would scoff at anybody that claims that using iPads increases productivity by, 20 or 30%. That's not the case. LLMs do actually increase productivity. Now, the counterpoint as well, spreadsheets transformed the financial world and also corresponded with a significant increase in employment in those financial services jobs. And that's what we hear from most tech companies is, look, there's going to be, yes, lots of changes to employment, lots of changes to the way that we work, but there's all these jobs and all this productivity that's going to be unlocked, and it's going to create opportunities that we just don't know. So there's all these jobs we don't know about. And that's kind of, I think, where most of these, and especially the panels, I hate panels, especially the panel, that's kind of where this conversation ends. It's like, well, there's going to be jobs created. Yes, there's going to be jobs destroyed. It's going to be a wash. And then we kind of just move on to the next topic. And,
Right.
What I would posit is, if you're taking like a 30 or 40 year arc, that probably is the case, or it's maybe reasonable to make that bet. But the pathway between where we are today and this sort of like new normal, where we've sort of like adapted society and the economy to AI integrated world is there's going to be a lot of people that if they aren't like, if they don't have the skills to adapt and to shift and to do ongoing learning, they are going to be left behind, and they shouldn't just expect to get those jobs in the future. And like the example, and like historically, you look at telephone operators. So there was like a period in I think it was the 50s,
Yep.
where it was rapid shift away from having sort of people like literally operating switchboards. And, the people who were hurt the most were older women, in their 40s, 50s, who had been doing it their whole career and weren't nimble enough to pivot into new roles. Whereas younger women, and it was mostly women who were working at switchboards, younger workers were a lot better off because they were able to pivot and, adapt to some of the new, there are all these new technologies coming online. So that's the question, I think, for all of us and for educators is how do we build those skills that are going to enable kids to make those quick pivots? And, maybe career searching, maybe just getting a job is the core skill. Like maybe we need to set kids up to be changing jobs like, 5 times more regularly than before. And maybe they're going to have multiple jobs. To me, that's probably the best we can do right now in school, in K-12, is just set expectations for, career pathways are probably not what your parents think they are.
I like where you started this. I like that whole answer. This stuff keeps me up at night too. It's hard. And I'm not hearing a lot of comforting answers out there from folks who know. But the idea that, having a framework of durable skills, that's durable skills is the new, human skills. But I like that term, to be nimble. But as you were talking, I was thinking like in higher ed, it's safe to say that career services has been an underutilized portion of higher ed. There was an uptick in budgets, but they're still not enough. I've got to think college and career advising in K-12 remains underdeveloped to what it should be. I know that, students are doing enough career exploration despite the national push to do more of that. Are you seeing institutions that are trying to help advisors know how to deal with this too? I mean, teachers are one thing, but the advising offices, I've got to think, are in a tough spot now.
I did a presentation for college counselors, and they came in, they thought I was going to come in and tell them about, oh, here's how AI can help you do your jobs better. And I was like, hey, actually, sure, AI might be able to unlock some productivity, but what you really need to be focused on is like the nature of your jobs is going to change. And that's the much bigger conversation. And their eyes were like dinner plates. And yeah, I mean, it's tough because, college counselors, guidance counselors, these are like the most overstretched people in districts. And so I want to be clear, it's not their fault. Like we shouldn't expect a college counselor to be juggling the 1,000 balls that they're juggling and also staying on top of, what is sort of like a week by week rapid fire set of developments in AI. And that's, I think, why organizations like AIED are so important is like we need to have, concerted, scaled professional learning that makes it easier for those professionals to stay in the know about how they need to be sort of like changing those conversations. I also hope that like there's a way for teachers to, I was just meeting with my learning team this week and we were talking about, is there a way for us to even further integrate career exploration into all of like our project-based learning activities that we develop for core subjects? Because the more we silo career exploration into this, temporal experience that students get twice a year, it's really hard to keep that up to date because these conversations maybe evolve on a month by month basis.
Absolutely. That's definitely not an exaggeration here. You're talking a lot, which I really like about career development for folks in K-12 and higher ed. I mean, do you see this as a educator workforce issue more broadly than just kind of traditional professional development? I mean, how important is this to the fundamental nature of educators' jobs?
I mean, this is a question for society to answer. I mean, there is definitely a world where, and I hear this a lot in Silicon Valley, and I won't name names, but, I've been at forums where people are like, well, this is going to, personalized learning is going to totally disrupt education, and that's a good thing. And it's not science fiction. I mean, you can go and, I saw this picture and I'll have to see if I can find it again, but it really was visceral to me. It was, like a gymnasium filled with cubicles, like thousands of kids in cubicles with headphones sitting in front of a computer, getting personalized learning. And, so can we replace educators with AI? Definitely. Should we? That's a different question. And that brings us back to how do you build those durable skills that are going to really be differentiators in the workforce? And I don't think it's skills that an AI avatar is going to be able to do. It's like, engaging classroom experiences have to be led by capable teachers. So I think the good outcome, and I think what we're seeing is that there's, the best case scenario is that AI empowers, it allows us to automate the most rudimentary and mundane aspects of teaching, gives teachers more time to focus on cultivating those engaging classroom experiences. And like the example is like, teacher using AI. I first tried to like use AI to just automate grading and then discovered there was just no way to get a consistent set of scores, against the rubric. You basically like train ChatGPT on, your grading rubric, and then you put student essays through, and, it's never consistent enough to be reliable. So then the teacher pivoted and said, okay, I'm just going to use ChatGPT to generate an initial set of feedback to student essays. And then he shared it with the students. This is an Anaheim Union High School District, Ray. So Ray shared the feedback with the students and said, look, this was created by ChatGPT, totally transparent. It might be wrong, and that's okay, but it's a starting point for our conversation. And so rather than spend the hours that he took writing feedback for each student essay, he used that time to meet one-on-one with kids and discuss the feedback that ChatGPT gave. And like, that's one anecdote, but it's kind of an example of how this could really level up the workforce. Something else that I just want to call out, and I'm curious if you're hearing this as well, now that ESSER funds are running out, despite the fact that we have a teacher shortage, I'm hearing from a lot of districts that there's impending layoffs. And that is an interesting paradigm that, we're not in a place at all where we're dealing with an oversupply of teachers. I forget the state. There was a state that normally turned out 33,000 new teachers a year, and they're down to 6,000 this year.
Crazy.
So new teacher pipelines, they're a dribble, and we're getting and there's all these layoffs. So hopefully AI can help to just address that shortage. And I think in the near term, it's going to be a lot more about that. They're probably in a much better place. Like, I'd rather be a teacher today than a software engineer, candidly. I'd rather be a teacher than an investment banker. So teachers should just, I wouldn't worry too much.
I like that you closed on a somewhat positive note there. And, to your point, I love the description. I am hearing, by the way, about the federal relief funds running out in higher ed and K-12. And I think that's a under-discussed problem. But to go back to the more positive, your kind of dystopian view of all the students in the giant gym, it took me back to like 12 years ago, writing about the math labs at community colleges. So, Austin Community College, Montgomery College here in Greater DC, they started doing this thing where instead of doing the classroom instruction for dev ed, remedial math, huge room of personalized learning, a Pearson My Math Lab course where students would work on their own, and then they would use keg cups, those red keg cups, to put up on top of their computer when they needed individual instruction. And, talking to some instructors there, they were like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be like. And I resisted this, but it's actually great. Like, it's one-on-one breakthrough learning, and I wouldn't go back. And, I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, but I can see from what you were describing that it kind of builds on that. There's the potential there for a different type of teaching, but not necessarily a worse one.
Yeah, so UC Irvine is doing a bunch of research into this, and June On is the person you should talk to if you want to get more detail about that. But some of the anecdotes that I heard also in Anaheim Union is when deployed as an augmentation to teaching, to a teacher in the classroom, they have seen significant increases in student engagement. They've seen significant measurable increases in assessment scores. And most interestingly, the students that are seeing the biggest increase in marginal engagement are the lowest performing students, the least engaged students in the classroom. And that's because instead of a teacher standing in front of a chalkboard, walking through a bunch of, equations, and then saying, okay, now go in groups and let's work on some problems together, the students are all getting personalized tutoring during that 15 minutes where the teacher would have otherwise been in front of the chalkboard, back to the classroom, and half the students are kind of like checked out and maybe napping on their desk or on their phones. So again, like really thoughtful teacher-centric design, I think will be a game changer. And I think it's like, it's going to be a critical tool in our toolbox to addressing the needs that we're going to have to like really sort of accelerate some of the evolutions that need to happen in education. My big message is, while those are really important tools and we need to be figuring out how to deploy them effectively and in a teacher-centric way, the bigger conversation is still, how does learning need to be adapted for those durable skills, that the adaptability quotient that students are going to need? And AI tools are just part. They're one ingredient, but there's other ingredients. And I think we just had a big funder retreat that AIEDU co-hosted with the Singleton Foundation last week. And, I think this is something that funders are really starting to hone in on, is like, there's not one lever to addressing AI literacy. There's actually a lot of different levers. And whether it's teacher quality or, like tool design and equitable implementation and design, or, research. And so the good news is, like, everybody, wherever you sit, like, you have an important role to play. But I think it's like, figure out what that role is in the bigger arc of the technology, and not just, how can, I'm not going to name any names, but like, how can X or Y, AI tool be rolled out across my district? Because my guess is that if you're focusing too much on the tools, you're missing the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. And, I'm glad you brought up the potential benefits to underserved student groups. It goes without saying, K-12 community colleges, open access for your publics. I worry very much, as does pretty much everyone, about a lack of access to these tools, to these skills relative to elite institutions. First of all, I'm curious, like, your organization is doing this, is trying to help in K-12. Who else is out there? And is there a role for government, for foundations, funders, to help those institutions that aren't getting access to the help they need?
I would say most nonprofits that focus on computer science or STEM have recognized that AI has to have some sort of a role. So I think most of those organizations are, either they have like formal AI initiatives of some kind, or they at least have sort of like internal working groups. Digital Promise comes to mind. They actually just published sort of like the first phase of an AI literacy framework that I think is really robust. And Digital Promise, it's an example of an organization that is very teacher-centric and very equity-minded. I struggle to imagine any education-focused nonprofit or organization not in some way having a role to play here. Now, this question of government, there's so many roles for government. The big ones are, ultimately, if you believe every student's going to have to graduate high school knowing how to use AI tools, it's like the computer is a bicycle for the mind, AI is like a supercar. We have to teach kids how to drive those cars because some kids are. And if you're trying to race, on your bike, you're going to totally lose.
Right.
So in order to get to that, you have to have really clear policies and guardrails in place, and procurement standards in place, and efficacy standards in place, so that we can eventually roll out these tools and get them in front of kids. I don't know that we're there yet. I think a lot of the tools, the reason that you're not seeing too many student-facing LLMs is because it's actually really hard to get the safety stuff right. And
Right.
I laud OpenAI and Google and Microsoft for not rushing into that, even though there's been a lot of push, because it's not easy. And so, but we, part of that is like having the clear guidelines. So that's one role for government. The bigger role, though, is definitely just funding. I mean, these LLMs are expensive. They are really expensive. We did some back of the envelope math, and it was like, hundreds of millions of dollars a year for states. And the challenge is, you have school districts that are like, oh, we're publishing our guidelines and our ethical principles for AI. And they usually will say something like equity and accessibility. Every student should have access. But what that really means is that we are going to be spending gazillions of dollars to cover the token costs and the GPU costs of these tools. Because the free tools are free only for a period, they're being subsidized by venture capital investment.
Right.
And, like, sure, maybe the price does come down long term, but we can't stake equity, technological equity, on the hope that prices come down to a place where they can just be rolled out for free or at low cost. We have to assume that there's going to be new line items added to budgets, maybe shifted from other stuff. I don't know what, schools are cutting budgets now. So like, that's also the environment we're in. But there's going to have to be serious dollars allocated. And again, I think that happens, right around the next recession. There's just going to be, a New Deal style flood of funding to try to help everybody adapt. And, a big part of that, I suspect, will be funding specifically to enable schools to start integrating those tools.
Well, that's a strong case, and I hope people listen to that call. Alex, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise. There's a lot for us to chew on.
Oh, my pleasure. It was really fun. Thanks, Paul.
We'll keep in touch. It's going to be an interesting couple of years. A lot of what Alex said there has really stuck with me, including that we may know more about the skills of the future than what the jobs will be. Okay, next up is Leigh DeLyser. Stick around. I'm here with Dr. Leigh DeLyser. How you doing, Leigh?
Hey, how are you?
Before we really get into your take on the space, I wondered if you could just give us a sense of what your focus is with CS for All.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the co-founder and executive director of CS for All. The CS stands for computer science, and we're really focused on making sure that every single school in America offers computer science to its students, and not just offers, but has students participating in those courses, learning high quality and rigorous computer science education. And at CS for All, like that's our end goal. But we do that work a little bit differently from the other organizations in the space. We don't have our own curriculum. We don't do teacher training or professional development, although I was a high school computer science teacher for over a decade. Instead, we have this big, huge membership and community of all the organizations that are doing that stuff and really try and help them collectively provide resources to the communities that need them, shine a light on where we're doing a great job, and also highlight places where we could do better and steer that collective work towards equity in computing education.
Got it. Obviously, important work anytime. I would think more so now than perhaps ever, depending on how important you think this technological moment is. And I guess to that end, I mean, how much of a focus is AI in what you're trying to do to help educators?
Yeah. We hear frequently how AI is like eating the world. And to be clear, it's been here for a very long time. Long before ChatGPT simply made it so that any citizen could reach out and ask an AI a question. AI has been embedded in everything from how Amazon knows you like those boots to why Netflix thinks this show is the next one you should watch. So we have all been dealing with AI for a very long time. And now its transparency, its availability has created a critical moment in time where it's even more important for the world to understand what's going on in these little boxes we call computers and how it's impacting our lives.
I like to think of them as magic boxes myself because that's about how much I understand of it. You know, I wonder what sort of urgency you're feeling from the educators you work with in terms of how to make decisions about AI skills, AI literacy, changing jobs that you're preparing students for. I mean, generally, it's hard to make a generalization about this, but are people feeling like they have a handle on this? They need to have a handle on it? What are you hearing?
Only in the way that you can have a handle on like a bull in a rodeo arena, right?
Yeah.
It's moving at 1,000 miles an hour. It seems like every time you turn, it goes in a different direction and there's something new to see, or the ground is in a different place. And I think educators and school leaders, despite being some of the most adaptive and innovative professionals in our society, are just caught by surprise by the way in which students are applying AI, the way in which society is applying AI, and the mismatch between the way we perceive the goals of education for youth to gain knowledge and be able to shine that back to us as educators and assessors in a meaningful way, and what AI means for that knowledge when it's more about organizing the knowledge, more about questioning so that you can get that synthesis as opposed to producing it yourself. So your question was like, do they feel stressed? Yeah. Do they have a handle on it? Not really. But I don't think that it's a crisis. It's a
Why
crisis.
not?
The call for focus on AI as a crisis, as something that needs immediate answers, means that there is an answer, that we know the outcome, that schools and teachers and students should have a fixed way in which to apply these emerging and changing tools that are happening in our society. And one of the things we do at CS Sprawl is we work with a lot of school districts. We have a program called Script. We do strategic planning with schools, and we ask them at the very beginning, why is education important?
Right.
Right. And what I hope is prompting us to do is to go back to that question of why is education important? Is education important to get students to regurgitate facts, to be able to answer multiple choice questions? Is it important to get them a job? Is it important to build good citizens who understand how to navigate our society? Is it important to eliminate some of the things and the disadvantages by what zip code you're born in, or what income your parents have, or what jobs your parents have. So I think we have to really think about, why do we send kids to school? Why are we teaching? Like, why are these the subjects that we study? And how can AI and its appearance in the world, just like a calculator, hubbubaloo about calculators in math class a couple
Absolutely.
more decades, we came around and said, well, here's what's really important. And I think we got it wrong. If you remember, about 15 years ago, there was a major shift in math education where we're like, oh, we're letting them use calculators too early and they've lost their numerical fluency. And so, how we are going to deal with AI is going to be really similar. It's a tool, it scaffolds some of the rote work that we had to do in the past. And we're really going to have to double down on, like, what is the key things we want kids to get out of learning? What are those exit standards that they really should have to be successful in whatever they do next? And how do we as society adapt the way we teach, what we teach, and the way that students use tools in our classrooms in order to turn them into the problem solvers we know they can be?
I really like the way you frame that. It doesn't seem to gel with the general conversation that I'm hearing around AI. And I mean that in a complimentary way to what you're saying. I mean, obviously, these are fundamental questions about the role of the human that relate to like most of education that I can think of. But to your point of how fast things are moving, the name of your organization makes me think about people feeling that maybe they're going to get left behind, right? Like if there are these really exciting tools hitting now and these really savvy companies telling you you need it now, I would think it would get hard to see the forest for the trees if you're a school administrator.
Absolutely. And, school administrators have 10,000 things on their plate. And it's a little bit like a doctor in an emergency room. Patient comes in and you have to make a decision what to focus on. Imagine if someone got hit by a car and they're in the emergency room and the doctor could immediately get a list of every single thing that was wrong, all the way down to the hangnail they have on their left pinky finger. There are things that they would prioritize, and there are things that would be like, we know it's not perfect, but we probably don't need to address it yet. And the hype around AI has pushed up, right? And this is when we hear a lot about, like, the cheating that students are
Yeah.
doing using the AI tools. That's pushed up the list as a triage moment.
Yeah.
And if we just breathe and we take a minute and take a step back and say, holistically, like, what are we trying to achieve here? And stop looking at it in a reactionary sense, we can really do some creative things together. And if we teach kids about AI, what it does and how it works, and why it's important, when it's important to use it, then we might see less cheating, right? We might see them using the tools in an appropriate manner to support their learning as a tutor, as opposed to someone who could write a paper for them. Because let's be clear, kids have been paying other people to write papers for them for a very long time.
Yes.
It's just that AI makes that faster and cheaper.
Totally makes sense. And yeah, I don't think you want to be knee jerk reactive right now. I mean, we saw how much of the early coverage, I was a traditional higher ed journalist. It seemed like all of it early on in the Chat GPT hype cycle was cheating. And that did not feel like an appropriate use of energy to me, even. But, I just wonder how common it is that people are taking that kind of philosophically holistic look at this challenge slash opportunity. I mean, is this something that you're seeing schools actually doing versus what mess do I have to clean up right now?
Well, it's always a balance between the two. What have you heard recently from some of your guests that have been really inspiring from the way schools and teachers are approaching AI?
I have to say there's a consistent theme that really firm, reliable information is hard to get, but also that there's some low hanging fruit, that general AI skills and literacy can be taught relatively easily, and that there are channels for how to get started. Is that consistent with what you feel?
Yeah, I believe that there are a lot of resources out there. The US Department of Education, in collaboration with Digital Promise, has released a report through the Department of Education and Technology that has a really great framing for how AI can both power education and for ways schools can set up responsible use policies in order to help guide teachers and students in what it might be. I think one of the challenges is that we're asking each of our individual leaders, each of our individual teachers and administrators to somehow become experts overnight, to figure it out. And so documents like this one from the US Department of Education, guidance from organizations like that, as well as some of the foundations out there like the K4 Center in California, which has released a new framework for AI in schools for social justice. We should be looking to those organizations and the frameworks they release as the early learning primers for our school leaders to make localized decisions about what's important for them. And the more we can lift up conversations that you're having, conversations like this one that are not the crazy flag thing outside the car dealership, right? Saying you must do this now. It's
Right.
so important, right? The more we can create that calm, that moment of time for the schools and districts to consider what's important to them, to create real responsible use plans, similar to the way they did as computers and cell phones started to really pervade schools a while ago. And then think about, great, now we have all this power at our fingertips. What are some of the creative test beds we want to, what do we want to try? Because I can tell you, teachers try new things every day. There's not a teacher or school on the planet who's not testing out something new to help students learn. And so we have this amazing nation of innovative educators and professionals who are leaning in, who are trying new things. And how we find and tell those stories is a really important part of the work that my organization and others can do. We can lift up those voices, those things that work, and be clear about the things that don't. And, hopefully the researchers and the community who've been doing AI in education for a really long time can also help as there's this rush to implement, give us the guardrails around what really works, what's been tested and proven in the past, and what needs a little more help, what might not be a best practice.
So what does help look like? What should help look like? I get like really well designed writing, like what Digital Promise put together, but what else are you seeing that you would point folks to even in as a general category of help?
Yeah. I think there's three real categories of help that are needed at this moment. One, we need frameworks. We don't need checklists. We need big picture. What is the goal? What are the shape of high quality outcomes? Because education in Idaho is not the same as education in Atlanta. Our classrooms will look different. The teachers will use different analogies and approaches, and the meaningfulness of that will be something different for the schools in different communities. So we have to live at the framework and at the big picture level in order to help schools and districts understand. So one is those frameworks that is also supported by research wherever they're at. Second, teachers and administrators need time to learn.
Yeah.
So we need to fund schools to give release time to teachers and administrators, or provide them with money for them to do work over the summer, not just to go to professional learning, but to come together in professional working groups of colleagues, to read those frameworks, to do the reflective work, think about what it means for them. And that needs to be supported financially. We can't just ask teachers to come in on a Saturday. We can't just ask them to give up half of their summer doing this work. We need to resource it so that we get our best minds doing it and that it's connected critically to those local ecosystems and the needs they have on the ground. So first,
Yep.
frameworks, like models of what in a big picture, like what's our finish line? What's the goal here? Local support for implementation.
Yep.
If we want to revitalize rural America, injecting a whole lot of money for teachers and administrators to spend time over the summer instead of doing other things could actually even be an economic boon to those communities. And then third and final, we have to highlight and support the stories of success.
When you talked about the professional development piece, we've had some other interviews with folks who describe this as really a teacher workforce challenge / opportunity, and stress the need for funding, which seems like something that's going to be tough right now. But I like that you're calling that need out. Is there a type of help that isn't helpful? Is there anything that you would point to to avoid for folks who want to try to help educators?
I think we need to be careful of the hype cycle. I don't think we need more calls to action that start with the phrase schools are broken or teachers are behind, right? We need to not disempower them as a first note. This is not a problem that is unsolvable by our education system with the right supports. This is not a moment where we need to tear down everything we have in order to recreate. So I think we have to choose our words carefully in the way that we come in to help. We need to leverage the educational expertise of those professionals in every single classroom across America, recognize that expertise as having value, but also complement it with the technological or professional expertise that exists outside. It has to be a partnership and not a savior.
Hmm.
And I think where schools find the least amount of help in offered help is when something is meant to be a drop in. Don't have to change anything you do, just do this 2 days a week, or take our thing and it's going to magically transform what you do without any consideration for what that might be already, especially because AI is such a technological innovation. Many of the people building it did not come up in classrooms.
Right.
Now there's an intersection between the tool builders and like ed tech, where you do have an intersection of people who did teach, like myself, who spent time in classrooms and are now in other positions of leadership. But even I have been out of a classroom for over a decade, longer than I'd like to admit at this point. And so would I know exactly what a modern math teacher does day to day? Probably not. And so anything we do has to be done in partnership, has to be done with curiosity. What is it that you do? What are the goals of education in your community? And how do we work to making a use of this tool or even the tool itself fit within that? Because if we don't do this in partnership, it's got to be one more thing that lasts for a year and then gets replaced next year with something else.
Yeah, we've seen that movie before. I really like where you started in this interview on, this isn't a crisis. Like, even somebody who is trying to focus on the opportunities with AI, I feel like there's a kind of a hopelessness that I sense that this is moving too fast. It's so overwhelming. Like, it's asking you the most fundamental questions about what it is to be a human that I sometimes am like, I'm just going to throw up my hands. I can't do this, And are you getting some of that from folks in K-12? Like, this is just something that we're not going to be able to keep up with and do a good enough job with. So I'm just going to kind of tune it up.
I'm not getting the helplessness.
That's great.
I'm getting the urgency,
Mm-hmm.
and especially for schools that are under resourced, who feel like they're already behind. We keep moving the goalpost of where they just have to be caught up. If you asked them 5 years ago, before COVID, what was the line? Like, where would we achieve equity between an urban school in New York City and a suburban school 20 minutes outside? And they may come back and say, oh, it's about the math and reading test scores, graduation rates, attendance rates. Like, they give you some really hard data.
Right.
When all of a sudden now we're implementing state standards for new subjects like computer science. So not only are your test scores, but the level of creativity that is part of what's infused into students' daily life changes. My daughter has access next year in middle school to a really exciting robotics program. Her cousins are doing 3D printing outside of Rochester, New York, right? If all schools don't have those opportunities for kids to be creative and not just answer questions, then how can we really call our educational experience equitable? And now AI, right? Here's the next thing. And here's the next thing. We keep talking about how the bar is going to be moved, how it's going to change the fabric of society and the way that we interact with each other as humans. So for me, the crisis is by making a push for this to be something you have to do right away. Of course, the more well-resourced schools are going to be able to run even further ahead.
Right.
So I think by leaning on this in that sense of urgency, we're actually creating a bigger challenge. We're actually creating more inequity than if we just slow down for a minute. Those of you who had run ahead, let's figure out what you're learning and help everyone catch up. as opposed to just keep going like further, faster, further, faster.
Yeah. And obviously, if you're leaping ahead right now, the odds that you will not get it right are somewhat substantial, I would think, on AI. And, and that gets it for me, even in the higher ed space, I think the concern that the community colleges are going to get left behind relative to the research universities is valid, but the pump the brakes approach gives me more hope there.
And the thing that we know that community colleges do really well is partnership.
Right.
Community colleges partner with each other. They partner with the four-year institutions that they feed into. They partner really well with communities. They do a lot of adult learning in addition to that, like fresh out of high school person. And so thinking about how we can leverage their strengths around partnership to not leave them behind or even to put them ahead. They're going to have their fingers on the pulse of things better than some of the research institutions that the campuses feel a little closed off, right?
Yeah.
Other than the companies that recruit directly from them, which may even be a small select group, right? I myself did a PhD at Carnegie Mellon. I can tell you I felt more connected to some of the technology companies that were recruiting from the computer science department than I did the Pittsburgh community where I lived. And so thinking about how we can leverage the strengths of each institution, how they can contribute to what success means. Because to your point, we're going to get it wrong. Back to that question again, like what does wrong mean? Is wrong doing active harm? Is wrong not going fast enough, far enough? Is wrong choosing the wrong technology? But let's be clear, this is not the last technological innovation that's going to change the world. This is not. We are going to continue to move the goalposts of the fabric of society with the technological innovations that are released to it. And so at Computer Science for All, our mission is not to build a world of software engineers who are proficient at the current tools. Our goal is to build a world of solvers where technology is an important part of their toolbox and where they're prepared to know enough about the fundamental parts of technology where when these changes come, they're ready to adapt and adopt and think critically to question what they should use when the next big thing rolls around.
Well, that seems wise. When you talk about the need for partnership, the potential for partnership, I was thinking again about the role for philanthropy here. It seems like an unusually potentially useful time for philanthropy. I think there's obviously folks in K-12 and higher ed who have initiative fatigue, but I think getting that assistance, you've mentioned that resources are going to be needed here, and that's obviously state and federal government first, but how much of a role do you think funders who have access to good information from the tech innovation world could be here? Because it feels like maybe more than usual. And, for some of these foundations, like maybe be a little more assertive than you're even comfortable being in getting out there to help here.
Yeah. And I think that notion of help with partnership is really important, right? One of the things that philanthropy can do really easy is they can convene, and they can convene with the kind of resources that allow people to participate. I can tell you one of the biggest challenges for getting voices in a room is how do they get there? Where is the sub that's going to take their place in a classroom, right? And how are we resourcing them for their time and any effort that they might need to do pre-work or post-work to inform actionable takeaways from that? So think about convening as a match that you light, not a candle that's burning, right? It's something that needs resources to get a kickstart. And then it's going to need you to think about how to sustain it because it's going to burn out really fast. So philanthropy can really support convening, not just for knowledge sharing, but knowledge action. Then the implementation dollars. How do they not just give X dollars for Y workshops in 10 cities, right? For, after school classes for kids or summer programs, things like that. How do they actually create the time for communities to come together and plan? Whether that community be school leadership teams, state teams, there's a whole lot of state summits around computer science and AI and ed tech happening right now. And with resources, those summits could make use of the frameworks that might be developed in some of those convenings in order to share out to schools and districts. And then as not just philanthropy, but venture capital really thinks about how they're investing in ed tech right now, asking the companies themselves, how is your solution using AI? How are you judging whether it's a success or not? One of the things that AI does is like we check how accurate its predictions are. And LA Unified just released their new tool, Ed, right, to support parents' plan, which can be super powerful. But it said that Ed had I think it was like an 80% accuracy rate.
Yeah.
You have to ask how it's getting it wrong. How are we getting things right or wrong? And what are the implications of that, especially for youth who are often disadvantaged by the system? So I think there's a lot of questions that the holders of the resources can do in order to make sure that companies are acting with intent and partnership, that they're being transparent about the ways in which they need to continue to improve, and that we keep thinking as a collective around the power of AI and what it really can bring to schools.
That's fantastic. I feel like you've given us a lot, not only to think about, but to start acting on here. And I love that, I feel like a little bit less panic myself, even listening to you. I take a deep breath. We'll get this is part of what I heard from you. Dr. DeLyser, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me.
Yeah, thank you. And I look forward to connecting with any of your listeners who want to talk more.
Sounds great. Let's definitely keep in touch. Thanks for tuning into The Cusp. We're available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe. You can visit us at thecusp.ai. The launch of this podcast was made possible by the collective philanthropic support of the Walmart Foundation, GitLab Foundation, Cognizant, and the KFOR Center. Thanks to our supporters and to you all for listening. Catch you next time.